think Ben, he perceives that the lack the way that 2-year-old, that we would always say a 2-year-old lacks, or experiences the lack. Because he's finally figuring out that he isn't getting it the way he wants it.
Well, I would add to that. He knows that things are not the way he wants them to be. That's why he's cried before. So it's self-evident that things are not the way that he wants them to be. I think that there's something very different about this cry in that there are despair elements in it. And the thing that is frightening, not because there's something particularly wrong with Ben's situation, but because it says something about what a human being has to discover, is that it seems that Ben just realized that no matter what he does, it will not make it so that he has what he wants. That is a scary moment. That warrants the cry that we just heard. So thus far, he's had essentially what he needs available to him in good measure, more or less, with some lack here and there, but the lack is something that can be remedied. In other words, he can nurse, he can be held, he can see someone he wants to see. But now he's finding, well, that doesn't satisfy this. No, I don't want to nurse. There's nothing to go to.
He's naked in the dark.
Yes, he's in the desert. He knows that there's no solution.
That's really scary.
And he knows it because he's had the experience of there being an adequate solution, so he has a reference point. A lot of us didn't get taken care of as meticulously. You know, not too many kids get to nurse on demand into their mid-twos. He has. So now these things are not quite hitting the spot, and he doesn't know what to do. So he climbs the counter to get the chocolate, and he stuffs his mouth full of 8 chocolates. That doesn't satisfy. Comes down, doesn't know what to do. Oh, mom holds him. That doesn't satisfy.
He tries to get back up again.
And then there's nothing there when he goes up because the chocolates have been taken away. And even if they were there, what good is it? And how rare it is that the hope that the next thing will hit the spot. How rare it is that a person comes to see that really there is no next thing that will hit the spot. When you see that every single square on the checkerboard is going to be lacking in a way that can't even distract me from my pain anymore. That is an interesting spot to be in. And very rare does it happen. Usually you can go your whole life going from one thing to the next, and it's like only if you get to be super wealthy, for example, do you realize that being super wealthy doesn't work. You're still questing for something. You don't even know what it is. But if you're not super wealthy, for example, you could believe that it's over there. Yeah, I just got to get to where Hugh Hefner is. And then I'll be, well, unless you experience the lack of...
And that's actually the all or nothing thing. Because then what's experiencing is that, especially with someone who's supremely rich, they're actually going to one end of the spectrum. And then and only then did they discover the true state of their experience. And on the other end of the spectrum, that the opposite extreme, so people can actually go through life going right down the middle, and that's how they can miss it. Because they're they're never actually sort of reaching for one end or the other. They're just sort of, they're going. And so anyone that does in fact experiences this, Barbara Dent writes, it's the experience of going to a train station in the middle of a desert, all of a sudden waking up, not knowing how you got there, and then not even knowing how you leave because there's no train going, or coming, and there's no train going. And so you decide to start walking. This is the part of the distraction part. You start walking, but as you walk, you realize there's no point of reference anymore.
Yeah.
There's now no longer a way that you can go back, something that you can actually comfort yourself with.
Yes.
So you start walking, and then you realize, oh, that didn't work. So you go the other direction,
right,
to the other end of the train tracks, and then you realize that there's nowhere there, and then you realize there's no train going, and there's no train coming, and so you're just forced to actually just sit down and be.
Yes. And
so that is so terrifying until you actually start just being in that spot. And so you don't leave. This is the key point. Mm-hmm. You don't leave. Because if you left, well, the only way you could leave is you go to heaven. Mm-hmm. But in this life, you would actually never, because then and only then do you experience the ability to just be. And then when you are seeking holiness, that is the only way that you can experience any gift, because you're going from such a lack.
Right. So there's the receptivity.
Right.
Now, let's look at this. What is it about just being in our raw need without the anticipation that we're about to complete this by our next action or our next 5-year plan of action or whatever, that there's actually no hope of completing it? What is so terrifying about that, such that it is essentially not done unless a person is forced into it by circumstances? Seeking it out is very hard. Going on a sort of spiritual path to find this takes a very long time. But if you're, say, enabled as an extremely, diligent playboy, for example, you'll come to the end of your rope a little faster. And then you're forced to face the fact that this is all there is, in a sense, and it's not enough. Now what? But, if you're going on the religious quest, you could go in circles for years and still not find. What's the scary thing about being in that spot?
Solitude.
Just solitude?
It is an experience of loneliness that can't be satisfied by anything.
And therefore it's contrary to human nature.
Yes.
Right.
So it's not just that it's scary and it's a bad thing that we don't endure the scariness. We're not just wimps, but it's actually impossible to stay in that spot by human nature alone unless we're forced into it by circumstance and we encounter the grace of God to allow us in our despair to stay in that spot without despair, I assert. It's impossible.
Yeah. And that requires stillness.
Is it that it requires stillness, or is stillness the fruit of it having been happening?
It is a direct result of what's been happening. And yet, it's both and.
Yeah.
Because you couldn't have willed that at any other point in your life.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you kind of knew what it was.
Yes.
And so, it's a both and, especially too, because you'll never fully experience it in this life.
Experience what?
Experience the stillness. But you experience it to the extent that you become aware of your emptiness and your need for something much different than what you've been seeking.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you've been seeking it through money or you've been seeking it through sex, all those things have been taken away.
Or rendered non-credible.
Or rendered, completely unimportant. Mm-hmm. So, there has to be filled with something. And that's the scary part, is that a desert, that's why a desert is such a sort of a, when you look and you see and what do you think of? It's so lack of anything good.
Mm.
Well, the only way, and every single time you pour water, it just evaporates. And every single time you try to plant something, it doesn't grow. So there's no possibility. So it seems hopeless.
Yes.
So.
And it is hopeless.
And it is hopeless. And that's why the action of God in that moment requires stillness.
Okay, so here's what sounds to be the model. There is, through combination of circumstances, a cornering of the human being, so that fortuitously they've searched to the extent of one direction of some perceived good and found it to be bereft of any produce. Then they've gone the other way, and the other way. So all of these avenues have been explored, and there is
a banging of the wall.
Yeah. And then there is dealt to the person something of a mortal wound, where they're not going to recover. They're not able to go back to the hopefulness of the quest. And in that mortal wound, there is either total despair and insanity that would result from sheer terror, or the grace of God begins to penetrate in a way that is, because it's the last resort, even though it's contrary to our nature, it's the only way that the water can go through.
And it's unlooked for, because all along you thought it was a different avenue.
Right. So that affects a degree of silence, which disposes the person to receive more, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and it's a stillness and a silence that's not necessarily a monastic silence of being in quiet. It's the quiet of the heart, of course.
Yes.
That can only be done when you're not, that only can happen when you're not reaching anymore. And it's almost as if it's almost as if you have to go into the fetal position and stay there till the point in time where the grace of God actually overcomes all of the obstacles.
Yeah. Okay, now looking at what you just described, the silence and the obstacles. So silence is an indicator of certain obstacles having been overcome, certain clamoring, noise-making.
Right.
All right, now let's boil this down even further so that we don't end up thinking that we're saying something we're not. It's not about silence as such. It's not a monastic silence. It's not about being quiet. It's not even about being passive as such.
Right.
A person could be very demonstrative or loud. Oh, it's very different.
Your personalities aren't diminished
Mm-hmm.
or change. It's more about changing.
Yeah.
Your personality isn't changed when you're in this state.
Now, let's look at the essence then of what we're getting at. What is the essence of this silence as opposed to the clamoring that would be there otherwise and pose an obstacle?
It's an unlooked for and unimaginable reception of grace that otherwise you could have never received otherwise, except for in that moment. And it's a situation where, just as when Jesus says in the gospel that you don't know what you are to say until the moment and the Holy Spirit will give it to you.
Mm-hmm.
In the same exact way, it isn't until the moment that you actually receive the fullness of that grace. In that moment, do you realize all that you needed. And not only just all that you needed, but the fullness of that to the extent that your cup is overflowing.
Okay.
And so there isn't any contradiction between your personality and this emptiness.
Okay.
To the point where everything changes,
Mm-hmm.
where the desert is such that this quiet, this nothingness
Mm-hmm.
is the only capable vessel in which you are actually capable to actually receiving it, and you don't know it until the moment. Because
Okay.
all along you've been seeking.
All right. I think I understand. So let's see if we can name some things here. If a person were to attempt to dispose themselves towards what we're talking about by means of what they understood to be silence, I assert, and I subject this to your response, I assert that it would be the opposite of what we're talking about by the fact that they're disposing themselves to it they're taking a stance against a perceived problem. So I'm going to take a stance of silence, and what we're actually talking about now is the opposite of that. In other words, their stance of silence is a clamoring. And that stance of silence itself has to be exploded by the disappointment, such that a person is bereft of means to effect the change for themselves. They come to the end of themselves, the end of their power to bring about the correct stance. And that's the mortal wound. So no matter where I put my head, my feet, my hands, it is the wrong place, because there isn't a place that I can put my energy like that and have it affect the change that is needed. Now, that's not to say that, therefore we give up trying to bring about the justice that we're seeking. Well, because if we do that, that's a default on the path of the good. We're just embracing evil at that point. Failure. Well, no. We have to try, like we're just single-minded to find justice and fail. But we try with our whole hearts and we fail.
It's the all or nothing.
All or nothing.
The interesting thing too about that is, and the gospel for Sunday is the fact that they're talking about that the temple is full of beautiful stones, has beautiful everything. It's beautifully adorned, and Jesus says that all of these things will be toppled over. Stone upon stone will no longer exist.
Okay.
Everything is overcome. This will no longer exist. We're talking about the end times here.
Okay. Another
Another way of looking at that, and Nick brought this up to me. This is very important. You can say that about one's heart. When you look at a method, your stance, how do we combat the perceived lack? Well, let's go into silence. Let's go into a monastic silence here. You are falling into the trap of thinking that there has to be a method.
Yes.
And what Jesus is saying is that those methods have to be toppled over by the one method. Just the way he says that the stone must topple over the stones. And the stone is the cornerstone.
Okay.
The stone that is the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. So Jesus is that stone. He is the method.
Yes.
Jesus is the only method. And so you have to what will happen when someone tries to go into monastic silence and he takes his stand, he will actually get totally blown over.
Yes.
And eventually he'll actually just give up. And it will be perceived as a total failure. He himself will probably view it as a total failure.
That's the whole point of why
But that's the whole point. And what Jesus is getting at is that it is not about these things. It is about the way.
Yes.
The way, the truth, and the life. And he is that stone. He is that way.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's only in encountering Jesus in that experience of total poverty, you actually knock down all the things that you're used to. And you literally start all over again.
By, in a way, refusing to start by grace. Because he's the one who starts.
Refusing to do it at all. Refusing to do anything that you perceived that was the right way of doing it in the first place.
Without in any way changing your will for the good. Or
right. You must not stop. Right. You must not stop trying to will the best. Because you couldn't even, actually that would actually be impossible. You couldn't not do that. Because if you got to that point where you recognized that the only way I can do this is to do the best that I can, will 100% of myself towards what little left I have. To get to that point, the only way you can know is to truly will the good. In the purest senses, to the best of your ability.
So it's not passivity at all.
As even Therese pointed out, which it seemed as if I would, she says it seemed as if I was being totally passive. And I was ridiculed for being lazy.
Yes.
And yet you could tell in her writings that she was giving all and loving all.
Yes. So, would you liken it to this? A person is in a dark room. They can't see what's around them. The room has limits, 4 walls, ceiling, floor, no doors. The person doesn't know that there are no doors. And so they want to move into the next room. So they go and bump into the wall. Well, they say, all right, well, not that way, so this way. And they bump into the wall and say, well, no, maybe back the way I came. Oh, they bump into the wall. All right, well, there's one more wall left. So they go and they bump into it. And so, all right, not so good. Well, let me feel every single part. All right, nothing. All right, well, there's the part above my reach. So I'm going to, spend a lot of effort to climb the wall. And so I get good at climbing. Well, there's nothing there. Well, maybe on the ceiling. So I jump up and, ceiling, jump up. I jump and touch every part of the ceiling. I examine everything. There's no way out. This is not good because I'm not supposed to be here. I have...
I didn't ask to be here.
I didn't ask to be here. I don't deserve this. And I have hope. And I'm not going to set aside my hope. But everywhere I touch, it's a dead end. And wait a minute, it seems like the room's getting smaller. All right, let me just check this out. So you check all it is getting smaller. Either I'm going crazy or it's getting smaller. Wait a minute, it's really getting smaller. And the ceiling is getting lower. I'm going to die really soon. Now,
and the only reason you have this desire in the first place is because you actually have hope.
Exactly.
That's the only reason why you would even make the attempt.
Yeah. So now, at no point here has there been a diminishment of hope. This person is still checking out every possible surface, has not resigned themselves to failure. And now, as the walls come to the point where you can feel them on both shoulders, and you're scrunched down because the ceiling and the floor are coming together, there is a space that's opened up that wasn't there before, and by surprise, it just wasn't there. You didn't dig through. It's just there now.
You didn't will any of it.
You didn't, but you're showing up to the fact that there's now a new space. What are your options?
It's to climb to that.
Yeah, that's what you do. And so you go through there and, it comes to a dead end. And now there's space. Well, I feel around. I'm trying to get to the next thing and nothing. It starts to close in. Oh no, I'm going to die again. I thought I was going to make it. Now, same thing happens. Another space opens up, this time on the floor. You go down. And you keep doing that. You go where you possibly can. And that's how you get through. You don't open the door. And you start to realize that. And so the whole frantic search stops being frantic. You're still attentive to where the wall opens up, but you're not frantic about needing to open up the wall. Because you know that it's going to open up and you're not going to die because there's someone opening up the wall at the last second.
So you still maintain the hope.
It doesn't change.
It doesn't change.
There's no inattention. There's no lack of zeal to get to the next part, but there's no frantic because you know how the outcome is determined. It's not determined by me finding the passage or digging through. It's going to be made apparent to me, and then I'm just going to be able to walk through.
And it was striking because you go from feeling like there was a method to try to figure out where to go, and maybe even the first and second time you in fact discovered this other space, it didn't process.
Or even the 50th time.
But eventually, there is the recognition that it actually had nothing to do, it was God's action, it had nothing to do with you. That you were Really, as if I had something to contribute to God's greatness.
Although we have to be attentive to what.
But we couldn't. You couldn't. The only reason you actually were figuring out where the next hole was because you were attentive.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that you actually couldn't, and that's the only reason why you're able to figure it out in the first place, and eventually why you end up becoming. You actually begin to sit still.
Yes, because it's the attentive is necessary. If we're not attentive, we will get squished, or we just won't move forward and we'll stagnate. The attentive is necessary, and the willingness to move forward, and the hope that there's some place to move forward to, and the dissatisfaction with where you're at. Now, what goes away is the frantic, the lack of trust that this is going somewhere and that I'm safe. I have all the pieces of the puzzle that I need. I don't know how the puzzle fits together, but I have all the pieces. So there's no anxiety about missing a piece. There's no anxiety.
Yeah, that's the biggest part is the missing piece.
Yeah.
Where it's missing piece.
And therefore, what goes away is just that which is inessential, namely the frantic, which doesn't have any efficacy. It's not actually a contribution.
It's a little misleading because the franticness is just sort of the outward experience of trying to figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
And when that goes away, doesn't mean you now no longer have any sense of zeal for finding the whole or finding hope or knowing what, or still desiring hope.
Mm-hmm.
It just means that there is a trust.
There's an alignment of faculties.
A knowledge of that there is in fact all of the pieces are actually here right in front of me.
Right. So effort doesn't change. There's always effort. There's just...
You don't need to look anymore because it's all right there in front of you.
Yeah, but you still perceive, will, and go.
Right.
And the frantic just goes away, and it never helped anyway. But we confuse the frantic for effort.
Right. And that's really what the spiritual life is all about. When all of the things about, Peter are talking about trying to, in a great amount of fear and trembling, seeking to find, we must work, Paul talks about frantically trying to find, trying to seek to purify yourself for the coming of the Lord, because it was sure for imminent that it seemed imminent that the Lord would come back very, very soon.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's at least a perceived franticness about that. But in the way that's interpreted today is how do I do? What do I do? Where do I go and find the doing? And if I'm not doing something, then you actually don't have the zeal and you're not a faithful person.
Okay.
That's where it's dangerous.
Right.
And so there certainly was a major lack in what people perceived Padre Pio to be. While certain people recognized his saintliness, other people thought he was crazy. And part of the craziness involved this seeming lack of caring.
I see. In other words,
lack of care.
Care towards what?
Care towards the goodness of others, as well as yourself.
Could you say more about that?
The seeming passivity would be perceived by his superiors as not caring. It was perceived as not caring about whether or not he was leading his brothers or the people in the square in front of the monastery astray.
I see.
And for one, he knew he wasn't, but he wasn't frantic about making sure that people knew what he was really doing. He said, no, it really is like this. He never said that.
Yes.
He made his point when it was necessary, but he never went out of his way to justify himself in any way. He never revealed anything. That's why he hid the stigmata. Because he knew he had all the pieces. I mean, he always had the pieces, but he didn't need to look for them anymore. They were already there in front of him.
Yep.
And so there was no sense of franticness going on.
Yes. And going further, there was no even non-frantic self-justification. So in a way, the frantic is a species of self-justification. I can make it right. It's imperative upon me to make it right, whether it's to get out of the shrinking room or to make sure that the parishioners understand vis-a-vis what could be perceived as my cavalier disregard. In other words, there's no effort from him to forge his own justice, his own well-being,
his own righteousness.
by his own hand. Why? Because he knows better? Well, no, because he's tried and failed and knows that it's only going to bring destruction, and it's intrinsically unnatural and blocks grace. That there's a complex metaphysical element to that, but
that's where the desert is rendered useless when you're trying to create something that isn't there.
Could you explain that further?
You were saying how Padre Pio's, the opposite of what he did would have been at every turn to confront his superiors about him being wronged,
Mm-hmm.
to confront any person about, even to, let's say, for instance, I believe it was, I don't know if, at one point the monastery was closed to any outsiders.
Okay.
And he, rather than try to confront his superiors as well as confront the people in terms of justifying himself or even justifying his superiors to the people.
Right.
He did nothing.
Yes.
He prayed.
And this seems like disregard.
Total disregard and a major violation of being a faithful Christian, a faithful Catholic,
Right.
a believer in God, because that is perceived as leading people astray, when in fact, the justifying itself would in fact be the destruction.
Yes.
Because you were saying that the deification actually leads to destruction, more so than, at least perceived anyway, than the not doing anything at all.
Okay. This is very informative in terms of the stance of defending or justifying oneself against some perceived threat, some evil, some misunderstanding, some false judgment. Taking the stance of defending oneself against that versus simply focusing on the justice due to the other, namely the one who threatens, the one who is seeking to undermine me by calumny, hypothetically. Changing from the disposition of I'm focused in my person on you and how you are in need of my gift. I change from that to say, okay, I'm going to focus on how you're coming against me and how I can defend my own interest against your threat. Now, this is a radically different stance, one to another. All right. If we look, the self-defense stance, the stance that compromises the gift of myself to you in order that I may be protected from a forthcoming evil, that stance is entirely contrary to the order of being. What do I mean by that? On original justice, on God's intended created order, there would have been no evil. There would have been no threat in that way. And each person is oriented towards being self-gift to every other. And so all needs to be met by means of mutual self-gift. There would be no instance of, I am taking a stand to make sure that my rights are ensured against your error or omission. It would not be there. So therefore, in the world that we have now, with much evil, any stance of self-defense, self-security, is intrinsically contrary to the network of relationships that was ordained by God from the beginning. Now, that's very important, because let's say, all right, you're the threat to me, and I pay attention to that, and I don't want to be threatened, so therefore I am distracted from my self-gift to you because of your threat, and I'm now into self-defense. You misunderstand me. I want to make sure that you get me right, you see. You're falsely accusing me. Well, I'm going to tell you where you're wrong. Right. My whole orientation is altered. My gift to you is suspended because of that. I'm not there anymore. My gift to all of humanity is therefore omitted because I'm preoccupied with self-security. Therefore, everyone around me, everyone not around me, suffers. There's a ripple effect of my lack, my absence. Now, that is going to cause all kinds of deprivation. However, if I let go of that self-security, paying no heed to my own threatenedness, none, but focus entirely on how I can give myself to you, my accuser, that will cause my gift to be present. So in other words, something that would have been otherwise absent is now present. And therefore you are elevated. Grace is enabled by my presence, because the grace comes through the human being who's present, who wills the good. God transforms it, elevates it supernaturally. Now, interesting. When a person drops their own defense, God, by the perfection of his own justice, his own nature being perfect, is literally forced to step in and defend the person who drops their defense. Because if he didn't do that, well, that would be remiss, wouldn't it? So there has to be then a supernatural vindication of the one who is under threat. Pio knew that.
And that's why no one else would want to do something like that.
Yeah.
Because you almost see the impending possible destruction if one in fact were to drop their defense
Hmm?
apart from God.
Correct.
And the only reason why Pio was able to do it was because he first and foremost knew the presence of Jesus in him.
Yes.
Because you're talking about the self-gift
Mm-hmm.
that's now suspended because I'm justifying myself.
Yes.
It's rendered useless to him. He actually doesn't need it anymore. Because Jesus has stepped in for him,
Yes.
he is able to be a self-gift only because he sees Jesus in others.
Yes. That's right.
And
It's not even a sacrifice.
He is not right.
Yeah.
He is not distracted by his own need for justification,
Right.
because all he can see is Jesus in the other,
And he can't lose,
and he can't lose,
no matter what happens.
And so there's no need to put up, because you are now you're not a threat to me. The other person is not a threat to Pio anymore,
Mm-hmm.
because it has nothing to do with what's sort of being said or what's being done to him.
Yes. And therefore, Pio and anyone else in this state can afford to give without even reflecting on, it's not even a decision, it's just done.
It's just done.
And it's done by God in the person.
And that's seen as nuts.
It's seen as nuts, yes.
And I mean, it's because we are perceiving there's a level there that isn't seen. Not necessarily, I'm better than you. In fact, that's what Pio's whole point was. I'm not better than you. You have Jesus in you as much as I do.
Sure.
What he was seeing was everyone has already been justified, so there's no need to do anything.
Yes.
In terms of creating your own justice. The justice has already been done.
You know that the part of scripture, you cannot serve God and mammon. Mammon doesn't mean money. It means this self-security that we're talking about here. Mammon versus God. You cannot be...
It's not one or the other. It's not, you can't have both.
Yeah.
And that's why he says, if you're lukewarm, I will spit you out. It's either you serve all mammon, or you serve God.
And there's no mixture between the two.
There's no mixture.
There's no mixture. So one strikes the other one as foolishness and death. So the person who is steeped in mammon, up until the last minute where God finally breaks through, and okay, transforming union, we can freely give without fear of loss. The one steeped in mammon will see what God is asking of them as absolute unfair destruction, vulnerability to the worst abuse with no chance of rebuttal. Crucifixion. As soon as mammon is replaced with the justice of God, and there's no lag time now, there's no empty, there's no time during which that soul is undefended. And in fact, what one would experience is, no, God is fighting for me, and they would see it, and it would be satisfying to their own need to perceive the justice coming forth. In other words, God is literally forced to step in powerfully by the individual dropping mammon, dropping it. And similarly, that same justice that forces God to step in powerfully when we drop our own quest for justice, that same perfect justice of God is forced to not intervene when we hold on to mammon. Why? Because it's unjust to have him step in on our territory. We've claimed this for ourselves. He will not take it away.
And the fear is that everything will be lost.
Yes.
And when in fact, because he's not taking anything away from you, he's actually making you whole, and he's fully replacing all of that stuff. You are actually made more fully alive.
Yes.
The fullest, actually. Because all of those things you perceive as something that you like in yourself, while may have had a certain sort of tinge of not necessarily directed towards the good, is now directed towards the good. And so there's no, it's not that you have evil in you, that you have an evil trait about you. It's that the traits that, while you were totally devoted to mammon, are now used in total devotion to our Lord.
Yes. So there's no lack of love of a good outcome. There's no lack of love of justice. There's no
default in you.
Yeah.
He didn't screw up.
Exactly.
Yeah. So the perception only is in the sense that it was all misdirected, and that you were, the misdirection was only sort of coming about because there was a fear of loss once given up.
And that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it?
It does, because it's hell.
Yeah. And human nature cannot accept loss. It has to be forced into loss by circumstance and then say, how do I get out of this? Well, eventually there's no way out because the room is closed in and God makes a way.
And that's why informed atheists are closer to the desert than those who are somewhere in the middle, in terms of those who believe in God but are split, essentially.
This is very important. I feel.
And this is why, and the reason why, and we can find this in Scripture, Pharisees and tax collectors are closer to the kingdom of heaven than you are. And
Pharisees and tax collectors? You mean prostitutes, right?
Prostitutes,
okay.
Right. Prostitutes and
tax
collectors are closer to the kingdom of heaven
than you Pharisees
are. Because there is a sense that there is more self-gift being done in the tax collector and the prostitute. There's a more undividedness in the tax collector and the prostitute than there is in the Pharisee. There's more division going on in the Pharisee than there is in that. And that's why, in a way, the desert is more scary for that Pharisee than it is for the prostitute. Because, and so when we talk about atheists, it's the same thing. A well-informed atheist who is really seeking and really saying, we see it a problem that there is no God. That this is actually a huge issue. At least what we have, the conclusion we've come to, is closer to the kingdom of God than someone who doesn't, who is willing to make compromises.
Interesting. I'm going to press this because I want to fully understand. I mean, why do you say the atheist finds it to be a problem that there is no God? Not all of them do. They're quite happy. In fact, that relieved. So
because in that sense, they're not rejecting the right thing. The honest atheist is rejecting the right thing. They're rejecting the compromise.
Yes.
And the reason why they can reject the compromise in the first place is because compromise is totally abhorrent to them.
Yes.
And so because it's totally abhorrent to them, when the justice does come in,
they see it.
It's a miracle, and it just, rather than there being any sort of lack at any point in time in between the moment before and the moment after, it just happens. Because the miracle happens. Because there's no need. There's no need because there was no sort of perceived... They
were already poor.
They were already poor, and they were already totally self-gifting.
Yes. They
were already all or nothing.
Yeah.
Beforehand.
Okay.
And so it is easier for a well-informed atheist to recognize and to be able to be open to the possibility of the miracle.
Yes.
They would, and what they say is, when they reject, what they're rejecting is not so much, they're not rejecting God, they're rejecting, obviously, as we've talked about.
Compromised God.
You've continually harped on the fact that they're rejecting the compromised God. And right, they should. As we all should, and that's the problem. We don't all reject that. I know I didn't necessarily, I mean, I guess I just didn't really know. I didn't really hear anything else. But as soon as I heard it from you, it became abundantly clear to me. I had actually never really entertained the question in the first place.
Which question?
The question of evil as a response to God.
Right.
In terms of suffering. It wasn't necessarily about, this is an easy question. It actually really just never came up. And so when it did finally come up, it was like a veil being lifted. And so, in many ways, I understood my own personality that much more. I understood why I was the way I was, which was all or nothing.
Yes.
And then it all made sense, because then I was able, with a clear conscience, and with utter conviction, that there wasn't a compromised God.
Yes.
And that it was easier to wrap my mind around a God who doesn't compromise than there was a God who does compromise.
Isn't it, though? And the possibility of actually giving yourself fully to a God who's truly good, truly a defender of the good, truly just, that becomes available.
And it becomes available because it was already being seen as black and white. There was already, it's either one or the other. You can't get both.
Say a little more, please.
The compromise requires a gray area. Uncompromised, it's just black and white.
Yes.
And so you either choose the good or you choose the bad.
Yes.
You choose God or you don't choose God.
That's right.
And so, someone who chooses the gray has no sense of desert.
Yes.
They can't even conceive of the true desert. Neither can the person such as myself fully understand the desert, or the atheist cannot fully conceive the desert until they enter into it. But it is impossible for the gray area person to even get to that point, because they're not already predisposed to a rejection of this compromising God.
And this gray area state, intuitively right now, I'm seeing that it's linked to that person who says, look at my yield of grain, I guess I'll build bigger silos and then each drink and be merry.
Right.
Because they have to rely on something other than the grace of the moment. You have to. You're relying on your ability to feel the wall and find the secret panel. Well, you're relying on your ability to jump up and touch the ceiling and find the exit. Well, there isn't such a secret panel and there isn't such an exit. So this night your life is required of you.
And they're not, it's not necessarily, oh, I'm going to stop trying because I know that there's another, I refuse to bang up against the wall because it's too much effort.
Yeah.
It's not worth it.
And now, when the correct picture of God comes to someone who has invested themselves in this gray, in this mammon model.
Well, I would say the mammon and the gray are two different things.
I would liken them, I'd say they're inextricably linked. So
they're linked, but it's not the same thing.
Okay. The gray is willingness to compromise.
Gray is willingness to compromise. The mammon is unwillingness. Well, we should define that.
But let's look
here.
at this. Why would someone be willing to compromise if it didn't afford them a benefit of defending against a possible threat? I say the compromise is mammon.
But isn't someone who is because they're rejecting the compromise.
Who?
The atheist.
The atheist is rejecting the compromise.
They're rejecting the gray area because the gray area is more abhorrent to them. The issue is that it isn't known to them that there's actually another option.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
They've actually only been shown one hand.
Yeah. So they're forced to use mammon because they haven't heard.
Okay, well now, okay. Yes,
yeah.
It is.
So there's
yes.
love of mammon, and then there's forced servitude to mammon. So when the liberator comes to those in forced servitude, the slaves run to the liberator. They recognize the voice of the shepherd, and they go.
Right.
Now, those who love mammon love their ability to defend against evil, not to be defenseless and let him save me, but love their competency. The Pharisees who are being lapped by the prostitutes and tax collectors, they will not welcome the message of the good God. They won't. They will not welcome the gospel of grace.
It would require no building of any silos.
Mm-hmm.
It would require almost actually burning half of the crop,
mm-hmm.
so that you have exactly what you need just for the moment, knowing that you actually have everything in that moment. Because why else would you build silos? Why else would you plant more seed if you didn't trust that you had everything?
Correct.